Isolde had long ago accepted that romance wasn't in the cards for her. Between running her tiny flower shop and raising calyx, her day was packed with early mornings, late nights, and an endless to-do list that left little room for anything else. Her shop, Wild Ivy, sat on the corner of a quiet street, a small burst of color against the gray of the city. She spent her days arranging bouquets, chatting with longtime customers, and keeping a watchful eye on Calyx, who often sat behind the counter, absorbed in coloring books or attempting to help by reorganizing ribbons in a way that made sense only to him. Their life was simple, stable, and predictable. She liked it that way. That particular Thursday had been a whirlwind, orders stacked high, a last-minute request for a wedding bouquet, and Calyx suddenly deciding he wanted to make a flower potion that resulted in a suspiciously green puddle on the floor. By the time the little bell above the door jingled, signaling yet another customer, she was balancing a roll of twine between her elbow and a bouquet of hydrangeas in her hands, already half expecting to hear a familiar voice asking for the usual. Instead, a man she had never seen before strode in, looking both important and lost, which was a combination she had never quite encountered. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a suit that looked absurdly out of place among the rustic wooden shelves and vintage vases lining the shop. His expression was one of barely contained urgency, as though he had been sprinting through meetings all day and had only just now realized he needed a gift. When his gaze landed on Isolde, there was a flicker of relief, as if she might be the one person who could solve his unknown crisis. "I need flowers," he announced. She blinked at him. "Well, good news. You're in the right place." His lips quirked slightly, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. "It's my sister's birthday. I completely forgot. And if I show up without something meaningful, I will never hear the end of it." He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling like a man accustomed to closing multimillion-dollar deals, but utterly baffled by a simple bouquet. "I need something that says, 'Thoughtful older brother,' but not, 'I panicked and bought the first thing I saw.'" Isolde set down the hydrangeas, wiping her hands on her apron as she studied him. "All right. Does she like classic, romantic, wild? And do you know her favorite color?" His silence was telling. She sighed, already reaching for a selection of flowers. "Okay, let's assume she has good taste, and we'll go from there." As she moved around the shop, gathering blooms with practiced ease, she could feel him watching her. Not in the impatient way most rushed customers did, tapping their fingers against the counter, but with a kind of curiosity, as if he was trying to figure her out. He had the air of someone who wasn't used to waiting, but he didn't rush her either. "You run this place on your own?" he asked, glancing around. "Mostly. My son helps by attempting to reorganize everything when I'm not looking." She glanced toward the back, where Calyx was currently deep in concentration, drawing what looked like a very intense battle between a sunflower and a daisy. A brief flicker of something, interest, maybe even admiration, crossed his face. "How old is he?" "6. And convinced he's an expert in floral arrangements." The man's mouth curved slightly. "He sounds like an entrepreneur in the making." Isolde snorted. "Or a chaos generator. Jury's still out." She tucked a sprig of lavender into the bouquet, adjusting it slightly before handing it over. "Here. This will say, I put real thought into this while also covering up the fact that you very much did not." He took the bouquet with surprising care, looking at it as if it had just materialized out of nowhere. "This is perfect. Thank you." "Flowers have a way of making people think you planned ahead," she said with a wink. "You're welcome." He hesitated for a second before reaching into his wallet. As he handed over his card, she caught the name embossed on it, Evander Dane. Something clicked in the back of her mind. She had heard that name before. Somewhere in the never-ending hum of news, whispered conversations from customers, and glances at magazine covers in checkout lines. He was one of those men, the type whose business decisions could shift entire markets, the kind who belonged in glass offices and exclusive events, not in the middle of her tiny shop, looking mildly impressed by a bouquet. Still, she only raised an eyebrow as she ran his card. "You don't seem like the type who usually buys flowers himself." His expression was unreadable, but there was amusement in his voice when he said, "I don't think I've ever been in a flower shop before today." That didn't surprise her. He took the bag she handed him, then hesitated again, like he wasn't quite ready to leave. "I might need more flower-related assistance in the future. Any chance you'd let me take you to dinner as a thank you for saving me from my sister's wrath?" It was the kind of offer she had trained herself to dismiss over the years, smooth, effortless, not meant to be taken seriously. But there was something about the way he asked that didn't feel rehearsed. She exhaled, shaking her head with a small laugh. "You don't have to do that." "Maybe not," he said, studying her with a curiosity that made her stomach do something inconvenient. "But I want to." She had no business feeling flustered over a man who had probably never had to struggle for anything in his life, and yet, she could feel the warmth creeping up her neck. Before she could come up with a good excuse, Calix came bounding over, clutching his latest masterpiece. "Mom! Look! This is Flora the Sunflower Knight, and she protects the kingdom from bad vibes." Evander glanced down at the drawing, then at Calix, then at Isolde. His mouth twitched. "I think that might be the most impressive thing I've seen today." Calix beamed. "Mom's really good at flowers. You should buy more so we can get pizza later." Isolde groaned. "Calix." But Evander laughed, full and real. "I'll keep that in mind." And then, just like that, he left, stepping out onto the street with the bouquet in hand. Isolde watched him go, wondering, against her better judgment, what exactly had just happened. Evander was becoming a regular. Not in the way her usual customers were, the ones who came in every Friday for the same arrangement, or the older man who always bought a single white lily with a quiet sadness that told her it meant something. No, Evander Dane showed up like a man who had never had to schedule anything in his life. He arrived in the middle of rushes, during quiet afternoons, sometimes just as she was flipping the sign to closed, flashing that effortlessly charming smile and pretending he had a completely valid reason to be there. At first, he claimed he was just checking in, seeing how business was going. Then he needed an emergency bouquet for a business partner. Then a thank you gift for a charity event. She was suspicious by the fourth visit. By the seventh, it was painfully obvious that no one in his life possibly required this many flowers. One evening, just as she was closing up, he appeared in the doorway again. She sighed, half amused, half exasperated. "All right. Who needs flowers this time? Your chauffeur? The doorman at your penthouse?" He leaned against the doorframe like a man who had never been told to leave a room before. "Actually, I was thinking of someone a little more important." She gave him a look, waiting. "You," he said simply. She blinked. "Me?" He nodded, stepping inside, hands in his pockets like he wasn't towering over her in an expensive suit that somehow made the shop feel smaller. "I figure I owe you, considering I've essentially been using this place as an excuse to see you for weeks." She huffed out a laugh. "So you admit it? Was it ever in question?" She glanced at the counter, where Calix's latest project, a collection of flowers glued together in what he insisted was a robot bouquet, sat drying. "I had my suspicions." He grinned, then, with a confidence that made her both irritated and impressed, he said, "Have dinner with me." It wasn't phrased as a question. It was as if he had already made the decision and was just waiting for her to catch up. Her instinct was to say no. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had learned the hard way that men like Evander didn't show up in women's lives like hers unless they were passing through. She busied herself straightening a stack of delivery slips that didn't actually need straightening. "I don't know if that's a great idea." "Why not?" She gave him a pointed look. "Come on." "Isolde," he said, tone shifting, softer. It's just dinner. Which was exactly why it wasn't just dinner. She could feel him watching her, waiting for her to let herself want this. He was patient in a way she wasn't used to. Calix's voice suddenly rang out from the back room. Mom. Do it. We can eat grilled cheese while you're gone. She groaned. Calix. Evander smirked. Smart kid. She sighed, shaking her head. Fine. But if this turns out to be some elaborate plan to get me to curate your floral needs for the year, I'm walking out. Noted. She regretted agreeing the second she arrived at the restaurant. The place was the kind of establishment that had a wait list stretching into months, not days, with lighting so dim it was probably designed to make people forget how much money they were about to spend. Everything smelled like butter and wealth, and the moment she stepped inside, she knew she was out of place. Evander was already waiting, looking completely at ease, chatting with the host like he owned the building. He caught sight of her and smiled, standing as she reached the table. You look beautiful, he said, like it was just a fact. She smoothed her dress. She had spent a ridiculous amount of time debating what to wear, trying to find something that wouldn't make it look like she had tried. She had ultimately settled on something simple, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed I don't belong here, but sitting across from him, surrounded by women in designer gowns and men who looked like they had inherited their suits, she still felt like an outsider. Evander, seemingly unaware of her hesitation, gestured for the waiter. You like wine? She shook her head. I'd rather not risk spilling a $50 glass of anything on this tablecloth. His lips twitched. Noted. Sparkling water? Now you're speaking my language. He ordered without looking at the menu, and she was vaguely horrified by how effortless he made it seem. The waiter didn't even blink, like this was just Evander Dane's usual routine, and why shouldn't it be? She leaned forward once they were alone. Be honest. Do you actually know what you just ordered, or was that just muscle memory? His mouth quirked. Do you want the truth? Yes. I picked things I remembered tasting at events and hoped for the best. She laughed, the tension easing slightly. The conversation flowed easier than she expected. He asked about her shop, about Calix, about how she ended up working with flowers. She asked about his work, his family, trying not to sound like she knew more about him than she did. His life was foreign to her, built on legacies and investments, while hers was built on late nights and hard choices. And yet, for all his wealth, he wasn't distant. He wasn't arrogant. I always thought the people in my world weren't real, he admitted at one point, idly rolling his glass between his fingers. Or maybe it was me that didn't feel real. It's easy to play a part when no one ever expects you to be anything else. She watched him, realizing with a strange ache that he meant it. What part do you play? She asked. His gaze flicked to her. Depends on the audience. The food was incredible, but she barely remembered tasting it. The energy in the room was different than in her shop, but the charge between them was the same, unspoken, lingering in the spaces between sentences, in the way his eyes followed her when she looked away. By the time they stepped outside, the city had settled into the quiet hum of late evening. Evander turned to her, hands tucked into his pockets. You regretting saying yes? She thought about it. About how easy it had been to talk to him. About how much she had wanted this, despite every instinct telling her to run. No, she admitted. But I probably should. He smiled, slow and knowing. You really think that's going to stop me from asking you out again? She exhaled a laugh, shaking her head. You're persistent. I prefer determined. She glanced at him, then at the street ahead, then back at him. Against all logic, she found herself hoping he was. Isolde had never dated a man who had a driver before. Or a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows. Or a schedule planned down to the minute by an assistant who spoke in clipped, efficient tones. It wasn't that she had never imagined what it might be like, She had seen movies, read books, overheard conversations in coffee shops about men who lived like this. But experiencing it firsthand was something else entirely. Their worlds collided in ways big and small. Evander never carried cash, while Isolde still used the change jar in her shop when the register ran low. He had eaten in restaurants where the menus didn't list prices, while she considered any meal that came with cloth napkins a luxury. He had never set foot in a laundromat, but he learned the hard way that she was not about to let him send her clothes to be dry cleaned just because he could. And yet, despite everything that should have made them impossible, Evander kept showing up. Some days, she let him take her to the places he loved, rooftop restaurants with dim lighting, art galleries where the paintings cost more than her shop would make in 5 years. Other times, she insisted on taking him into her world. Late-night diners with sticky booths. Walks through the city where no one recognized him. Evenings spent in her apartment, where the only entertainment was a deck of playing cards and the hum of the radio in the background. He never complained. He never looked bored or uncomfortable. He never made her feel like her world was any less than his. One evening, they ended up at a tiny neighborhood food stall, one of the spots she had been going to since before Calix was born. The kind of place where the owner knew her order by heart and the only seating was a row of rickety stools that wobbled if you weren't careful. Evander took a bite of his food and let out a quiet, almost reverent sigh. "This is the best thing I've ever eaten," he announced. Isolde grinned. "Better than whatever your personal chef makes?" "Infinitely." She laughed, shaking her head. "You realize you've got sauce on your $1,000 suit, right?" He looked down, completely unfazed. "Worth it." It should have been strange, watching him, Evander Dane, billionaire, business mogul, man whose name appeared in glossy magazines, elbow deep in street food, but it wasn't. If anything, it was ridiculously endearing. That night, when he walked her home, he stopped just outside her building and turned to her with a rare, uncharacteristic seriousness. "You know I don't care about any of that, right?" he asked. She frowned. "Any of what? Where you come from? How much money you make? The fact that you live above a bakery instead of in a penthouse?" She crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "I know that you don't. But your world does." His jaw tensed, and for a second, she wondered if he was going to argue. Instead, he simply nodded, reaching out to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Then I guess I'll just have to make them understand," he murmured. Evander and Calix had a slow-building kind of bond. Not forced, not immediate, but undeniably real. At first, Calix eyed him with suspicion, as though he were trying to determine whether this new man in his mother's life was going to stick around. Evander, to his credit, never pushed. He simply let Calix take the lead, showing up with small gestures, an extra chocolate chip cookie from the cafe next door, a stack of coloring books left, accidentally, in the back seat of his car, a serious discussion about why robots absolutely could be built out of flowers. One day, Isolde walked into the shop to find them hunched over the counter, whispering in conspiratorial tones. She raised an eyebrow. "Do I even want to know what's happening here?" Calix grinned, looking far too pleased with himself. "Evander's teaching me how to negotiate." Evander leaned back, expression mock serious. "Your son has a natural talent. You should be worried." She placed her hands on her hips. "Do I want to know what's being negotiated?" Calix puffed up with pride. "Higher allowance." She groaned. "Fantastic. My 6-year-old is learning corporate tactics." Evander winked. "Just preparing him for his future empire." A few weeks later, she found them side by side on the couch, deep in conversation about some elaborate scheme involving building a treehouse that doubled as a secret hideout. "I told you," Calix said, very seriously, "if we're gonna have a treehouse, it needs to have a lookout tower." Evander nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right. Structural integrity is key." Isolde leaned against the doorframe, watching them with something that felt dangerously close to fondness. She had been so certain that letting Evander into their lives was a mistake. That he would be like everyone else who had tried and failed to stick around. But he was proving her wrong. Slowly, steadily, he was becoming part of their world. One day, Calix grabbed Evander's hand without thinking, tugging him toward a shop window to show him something. It was small, barely noticeable. But Evander's expression softened, and Isolde realized something with startling clarity. Evander wasn't just in this for her. He was in this for both of them. Isolde had spent the morning wrestling with a particularly difficult flower order. A woman had called in a panic, insisting she needed something dramatic but subtle, elegant but rustic, expensive looking but not too extravagant. Isolde had nodded along, murmuring, of course, while frantically trying to interpret the contradictory request. By noon, she was elbow-deep in ribbons and eucalyptus stems, and by 2, she was seriously considering renaming the shop Guesswork and Ivy. Calix had been circling the counter, occasionally pausing to inspect her work before offering unfiltered opinions. "That one's too fluffy," he declared, watching her rearrange a bundle of peonies. "They're supposed to be fluffy," she said, biting off a piece of floral tape. "But it's like, too fluffy. Like a poodle got lost in there." She sighed, swapping out a few stems. "Better?" He considered. "Now it's half a poodle." Before she could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and Evander walked in, looking dangerously pleased with himself. "You look suspicious," she said immediately. "That's an unfair assumption," he replied, setting a pastry bag on the counter. "I brought snacks." Calix lit up. "From the bakery next door?" Evander nodded, already handing him a croissant. "Consider it a bribe." Isolde narrowed her eyes. "What are you bribing us for?" He grinned, entirely unapologetic. "I'm here to see you, of course." She gave him a pointed look but took the pastry anyway. "Fine. You're allowed to stay." Evander watched her work as he leaned against the counter, perfectly at ease in a way that always baffled her. He had boardrooms, investment meetings, a world built on high-stakes decisions, and yet, here he was, spending his afternoon in a flower shop, looking like he had nowhere better to be. At one point, he reached out and gently plucked a leaf from her hair. "You've got a little something." She huffed, brushing off her apron. "Occupational hazard." Calix, still engrossed in his croissant, barely looked up. "Evander, what do you even do when you're not here?" Evander considered the question, then shrugged. "Mostly make boring business calls." "Then why are you here all the time?" Isolde froze, waiting for Evander's response. He didn't hesitate. "Because your mom is my favorite part of the day." The words were casual, but the weight behind them was anything but. Isolde felt something unravel in her chest, something she had been holding onto tightly, afraid to trust. Evander turned his attention back to her. "Can I steal you for a second?" She blinked, surprised. "Now?" "Now." He reached for her hand, warm and steady, and led her toward the back of the shop. She followed, still brushing stray petals from her apron, still wondering what exactly he was up to. When they reached the small storeroom, he turned to face her, suddenly serious. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," he admitted. "No, months." She frowned. "Thinking about what?" He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "About how none of this makes sense. You and me. The way we live in completely different worlds. The way everyone in my life keeps waiting for me to come to my senses." Her stomach tightened. "Evander." He cut her off. "But here's the thing, Isolde, I have never been more sure of anything." She stilled, heart pounding. "I love you," he said, voice steady. "I love your sarcasm, your stubbornness, the way you talk to flowers like they can hear you." I love that you don't care about the things I was raised to believe were important. And I love Calix, the way he sees the world, the way he's already smarter than me at 6 years old. Isolde opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Evander reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, holding it up between them. I know this is fast, and I know your instinct is going to be to overthink it, but I need you to listen to me, he said, taking a step closer. I don't care about status or where you fit in my world. You are my world. Her throat was tight. Evander. I want to marry you, he continued, flipping the box open. Inside, a ring glinted in the dim light, simple but stunning. Not because of obligation, or because I think you need saving, but because I can't imagine waking up another day without knowing you'll be next to me. She stared at him, at the ring, at the certainty in his expression. This was ridiculous. Impossible. She wasn't the kind of woman who had fairy tale endings. She had spent years learning to stand on her own, teaching herself that depending on someone else was dangerous. But Evander wasn't someone else. He was the man who spent afternoons in her tiny shop, learning the names of flowers just to impress her. The man who let Calix explain entire fantasy worlds to him, nodding along with genuine interest. The man who had taken her to the fanciest restaurant in the city and then sat on the sidewalk afterward, eating cheap street food like it was the best meal he'd ever had. And, for once, she let herself want it. She let herself believe that this was real, that love didn't always have to come with strings. Her lips parted, the words catching in her throat. Yes, she finally whispered. Evander exhaled sharply, like he had been holding his breath, and then he was laughing, a deep, relieved sound. She barely had time to process before he was slipping the ring onto her finger, before he was pulling her in, before his mouth was on hers, soft and sure and everything she had never let herself dream about. Calix's voice broke through the moment. Are you guys done in there? Because I'm really bored. Evander pulled back, grinning. Guess we should tell him, huh? Isolde let out a shaky laugh, pressing her forehead to his for just a second longer before pulling away. Yeah, she murmured, smiling. Let's tell him. Isolde had never been the kind of girl who dreamed about weddings. Other girls in school had folders filled with magazine clippings of lace dresses and diamond rings, but she had always thought it was a little ridiculous to plan for something that wasn't guaranteed. Even as a teenager, she had understood that love was fickle, that people left, that promises weren't concrete, no matter how earnestly they were spoken. She had learned this lesson young, but Alistair had driven it home. They met when she was 21, waitressing at a restaurant that wasn't particularly great but had decent enough tips. He had been one of those effortlessly charming types, the kind who made eye contact just a little too long, who had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. He wasn't rich, wasn't powerful, but he had a certain confidence that made it seem like he would be one day. And when he zeroed in on her, she had been young enough, naive enough, to believe that meant something. The relationship had been fast, but not in a way that had felt reckless at the time. They moved in together after a year, and for a brief moment, she thought maybe she had been wrong about love. Maybe it wasn't always temporary. Then she got pregnant. The test had barely dried before Alistair started pulling away. First, it was little things, missed dinners, unanswered texts, an inexplicable irritability every time she brought up baby names. Then it was big things, nights he never came home, fights that ended with him telling her he wasn't ready for this, that he didn't want to be tied down, that she had trapped him. By the time she was 6 months along, she was alone. She hadn't begged him to stay. Hadn't pleaded. She had watched him pack his things, had stood in the doorway with her hand on her stomach, and had told herself she had always known it would end this way. And then there was Calix. She had never known it was possible to love someone so much it hurt. He came into the world tiny and red-faced and screaming, and she had stared down at him and realized he was the only person she had ever fully trusted. She hadn't thought about dating after that. There was no time. No energy. And even if there had been, she had no interest in handing her heart to someone who would inevitably drop it. So she worked. She raised her son. And she convinced herself this was enough. Evander had spent his entire life surrounded by wealth, but it had never belonged to him. Not really. It had belonged to expectations, to people who wanted something from him, to a world where everything was polished and perfect, but nothing was real. He had been raised by people who saw love as a transaction, something that was given strategically, something that was calculated rather than felt. His father had run their empire with the efficiency of a machine, and his mother had played the part of perfect wife, perfect hostess, perfect woman so well that he sometimes wondered if she even knew who she was beneath it all. He had spent his childhood in houses too big to feel like home, shaking hands with men who would one day be his competitors, learning the right things to say, the right people to trust. He had been groomed for a certain kind of life, one where he would one day marry well, build his portfolio, continue the legacy. But the older he got, the more he realized he wanted nothing to do with it. His father had never understood why he didn't follow the rules. Why he didn't want to settle down with some perfect heiress. Why he refused to join the board at 23, why he spent so much time trying to build something separate from the family name. Evander had seen what money did to people. He had seen how cold it made them, how it turned relationships into business deals, how it ate away at people until all that was left was a hollow shell wrapped in designer suits and expensive cologne. So he had rejected it. He had built his own company, refused his father's funding, walked away from the life that had been planned for him. It had taken years to prove himself, to show the world he wasn't just another rich man's son. But he had done it. Still, something had been missing. He had dated, of course. But the women he met were always too polished, too careful, too rehearsed. They weren't real. They were playing the same role his mother had played his whole life, the one he wanted no part of. Then he met Isolde. And suddenly, nothing else had ever felt realer. The news broke faster than Isolde had anticipated. One minute, they were standing in the back of her shop, Evander slipping a ring onto her finger, and the next, she was staring at her own name in a society column, sandwiched between a fashion event in Milan and an exclusive gala in Paris. Evander Dane engaged to unknown florist. Who is she? Dane heir chooses love over legacy, socialites left stunned. Billionaire engaged to single mother, fairy tale or scandal? She had known people would talk. He was Evander Dane, after all. He wasn't just a man, he was a headline. But seeing it in bold print, seeing herself reduced to nothing more than a curiosity, a footnote in his story, made her stomach churn. Evander, naturally, found the entire thing hilarious. Unknown florist, he read aloud, grinning as he leaned against her kitchen counter, scrolling through his phone. That's a little harsh. At the very least, they could have said local business owner. She shot him a look. Oh, yes, that's the issue here. He set his phone down and pulled her into him, hands resting easily on her waist. You knew they'd make a big deal out of this. She sighed, pressing her forehead to his chest for a moment. I was hoping it would take them longer. Celine Dane read the same headlines with a much different reaction. She sat at her vanity, the morning light catching the cool silver strands in her otherwise dark hair, her fingers tightening slightly around the porcelain teacup in her hand. Across the room, her assistant shifted nervously, waiting for some kind of reaction. Celine simply exhaled, setting her cup down with careful precision. Well, she murmured, tone unreadable, it seems my son has made a rather unexpected choice. The assistant hesitated. Would you like to? No, she cut in smoothly. Not yet. She had learned long ago that emotions had no place in business, and this was business. Her son was set to inherit an empire, and yet he had chosen a woman with no name, no standing, no connections. It was reckless. Still, there was no need to act impulsively. Not when there were other ways to handle this. Isolde had never attended a charity gala before. The room was too bright, the voices too polished, the smiles too sharp. Waiters drifted between high-backed chairs and towering floral arrangements, trays balanced effortlessly in their hands, champagne flutes glinting under the chandeliers. She smoothed a hand over the fabric of her dress, one Evander had insisted on buying, because, according to him, if society was going to be watching, they might as well have something to admire. "Relax," Evander murmured beside her, his hand resting easily against her back. "It's just a bunch of overdressed people pretending to care about things they don't actually care about." She arched a brow at him. "That's comforting." He smirked. "Welcome to my world." She had met his friends before, but tonight was different. Tonight, the entire room was studying her, filing her away in their minds under categories she couldn't see. Some offered polite smiles, a few even seemed genuinely curious, but there were others, women in shimmering gowns, men in custom-tailored suits, who weren't as subtle. They tilted their heads just slightly when she spoke, as if trying to decode an unfamiliar dialect. They asked pointed questions. "So, you own a flower shop? How charming. And you have a child, yes? How modern of Evander. It must be so overwhelming stepping into a world like this." She was no stranger to judgment, but this was something else entirely. Evander, for his part, seemed completely unaffected. He held her hand, made easy conversation, laughed in the way that made people want to be near him. But every time he caught someone looking at her a little too long, his grip tightened slightly, his eyes sharpened just enough to send a message. At one point, he leaned in and murmured, "If you're tired of this, we can leave." She glanced around the room, at the glittering gowns, the carefully calculated smiles, the silent assessments happening all around her, and then back at him. "No," she said, lifting her chin just slightly. "I think I'd like to stay." The Dane estate looked less like a home and more like a statement. The kind of place designed to remind people of their place in the world, with its towering gates, sweeping driveways, and chandeliers the size of small cars. Isolde had seen it in pictures, but standing in front of it now, in heels that already hurt and a dress that probably cost more than her rent, she couldn't shake the feeling that she did not belong here. She had tried not to dwell on it as they drove up, but now, watching valets in pressed uniforms whisk away luxury cars, hearing the murmured greetings of guests who had known each other since birth, she felt out of place in a way she hadn't since high school, when she had once accidentally worn the wrong color shoes to a friend's wedding and spent the entire night convinced people were whispering about it. Evander, ever attuned to her moods, reached for her hand as they stepped onto the grand terrace. "Breathe," he murmured, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. She exhaled. "Easy for you to say." He grinned. "Not really. I hate these things." The statement was so casual, so completely at odds with the polished confidence he carried everywhere, that she turned to him in surprise. "You do?" His mouth quirked. "Endless small talk with people who are only here to be seen? What's not to love?" She snorted. "Well, when you put it like that." They stepped through the massive double doors, and suddenly, the space opened up around her, glittering and grand, like something straight out of a movie. A string quartet played in the corner, waiters moved effortlessly through the crowd balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, and every single guest looked like they had been handpicked for aesthetics. There was no one here from her world. No florist friends. No neighbors. No one from the coffee shop where she always stopped in the mornings. Just wealth, status, and generations of power moving through the room like they owned it. Evander leaned down slightly. "Still breathing?" She let out a slow breath. "Jury's out." He squeezed her hand. "Stick with me. You'll be fine." A waiter approached with a tray, and before she could politely decline, Evander plucked a glass from it and handed it to her. "Champagne makes everything better." She took a sip and immediately regretted it when a tall, impeccably dressed woman materialized in front of them, all sharp cheekbones and discreetly appraising eyes. Evander. The woman's voice was smooth, polite, impossibly refined. How lovely to see you. Karina, Evander said smoothly, giving her the kind of smile that revealed nothing. I don't believe you've met my fiancé. Isolde saw the woman's gaze flicker just slightly before her smile returned, this time faintly indulgent. Oh, I've read so much about you, she said, extending a hand. Isolde shook it, noting the deliberate pressure, the kind of handshake that communicated exactly where someone thought they stood in the hierarchy of things. How wonderful, Karina continued, her tone just shy of patronizing, that Evander has found someone refreshing. Evander's grip on Isolde's waist tightened slightly, but before he could respond, Karina's attention had already shifted to another passing guest, and just like that, she was gone. Isolde exhaled. That was fun. Evander rolled his eyes. She's always been charming. She glanced around the room, watching as more heads turned in their direction, more measured smiles sent their way. Are they all going to be like that? He kissed the side of her temple, completely unbothered. More or less. She sighed. Great. They made their way through the crowd, pausing every so often as more people approached, business partners, family friends, socialites who spoke in the same practiced cadence, who measured their words like currency. Isolde did her best to keep up, to hold her own, but she could feel the scrutiny, the way some people's gazes lingered just a little too long, the way their compliments felt more like observations, something to be analyzed later. Then the energy in the room shifted. The kind of shift that was immediate, instinctive. The conversations didn't stop, but something adjusted, an almost imperceptible awareness rippling through the space. Isolde followed the unspoken movement of the crowd and saw her. Celine Dane had arrived. She moved through the party without hesitation, a woman who had spent decades commanding attention without demanding it. Her gown was sleek and precise, every inch of her composed, elegant, controlled. Isolde had seen pictures of her before, but nothing compared to the real thing. She was formidable, the kind of woman who could dismiss you with a glance and ruin you with a well-placed word. She made no effort to find Evander in the crowd, because of course she didn't have to. The crowd would move around her. And it did. Within seconds, she was in front of them, and Isolde felt the weight of her gaze. Evander, to his credit, didn't hesitate. Mother. Celine smiled, but it was the kind of smile that was practiced, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. Evander. Her attention shifted, ever so slightly. And you must be Isolde. Isolde held her ground. It's nice to meet you. Celine's expression did not change. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, with the precision of a scalpel, she murmured, I see my invitation to discuss things before the engagement was overlooked. Evander's jaw tightened. We didn't think there was anything to discuss. Celine's gaze flickered toward Isolde again, assessing, before she smiled that polished, unreadable smile. Of course. Then she turned to the rest of the room, and just like that, the moment was over. Isolde exhaled, the tension in her shoulders finally registering. Evander leaned down, whispering against her temple. She's just getting started. A waiter passed by with a silver tray of champagne flutes, and Isolde, who had not previously considered herself much of a drinker, was seriously contemplating taking another. The guests had settled into easy conversations, laughter chiming across the room in carefully modulated tones, the kind that never got too loud, too genuine. Isolde had met at least 20 people whose names she had already forgotten, all of whom had been polite, but with the kind of politeness that felt sharp around the edges. Evander had stayed close, never letting go of her hand for long, making introductions, offering the occasional reassuring glance. He was perfectly at ease, moving through the crowd like a man born to this world, while Isolde was still trying to determine whether she was meant to be here at all. And then Celine appeared again, slipping into conversation with the same effortless grace she did everything else. It's been such a lovely evening, she said, smiling at no one in particular. I do always find these celebrations to be a testament to the power of tradition. Isolde caught the slight emphasis on the word. Celine turned to her, gaze assessing but still pleasant. You must feel so overwhelmed by all of this. Isolde kept her expression neutral. It's certainly an adjustment. Celine tilted her head, as if studying her under a microscope. And yet, you've adjusted so admirably. It's quite impressive, really. Not many would be able to adapt so seamlessly to a world so vastly different from their own. There was a pause, one just long enough for the weight of the words to settle. A few guests exchanged quick glances. Someone stifled a chuckle. Isolde smiled. I've always been a fast learner. Celine returned the smile, but there was something colder in it now. She turned to the small group around them, effortlessly drawing them into the exchange. I was just saying to Evander's godmother the other day, there's something quite refreshing about seeing someone step into a new world with such confidence. So many would be intimidated. Isolde took a sip of champagne before answering. Intimidation requires fear. I can't say I've been afraid of much. There was a beat of silence. Then one of the guests, a woman in a silver gown with diamonds dripping from her ears, let out a low, approving laugh. Celine didn't blink. Evander, who had been in conversation with someone else nearby, had caught just enough of the exchange to frown slightly. He turned toward his mother, voice smooth but pointed. Mother, I don't think anyone has ever accused Isolde of lacking confidence. Celine lifted her glass in agreement. No, of course not. She turned back to Isolde, eyes unreadable. Confidence is a useful trait. It can take a person quite far. Isolde knew when she was being studied. Celine wasn't being outright cruel, wasn't being openly dismissive. That would have been too easy to fight back against. Instead, she was doing something far more effective. She was planting seeds, weaving just enough doubt into her compliments to make people wonder. She wasn't saying Isolde didn't belong here. She was letting everyone else reach that conclusion on their own. A man in a tailored tux spoke up from across the group. Evander, you've always had an eye for business. Wasn't expecting that same skill to extend to your personal life. Evander's grip on his champagne tightened slightly. And what exactly does that mean, Harrison? The man shrugged, completely unbothered. Nothing at all. Just an observation. Celine laughed, light and gracious. Oh, come now. It's quite the story, isn't it? One can't blame people for being curious. Evander's expression cooled. Isolde, who had spent years learning how to hold her ground, tilted her head slightly, gaze level. If curiosity is what brought everyone here tonight, I'd hate to disappoint. Another pause. This time, more than a few guests smirked behind their glasses. Celine lifted her drink with practiced ease, eyes never leaving Isolde's. Oh, she murmured, I don't think you will. A waiter passed by with another tray of champagne, and Isolde resisted the urge to grab one just to have something to do with her hands. The room had taken on a certain charged energy, one that settled heavy in the air, winding tighter with every passing moment. She could feel the weight of eyes on her. Watching, waiting. Some polite, some curious. Others sharp, gleaming with a kind of well-practiced amusement, like they already knew exactly where this was going. Evander had stepped away only briefly, caught in a conversation with an executive whose name Isolde had already forgotten. She had been standing by the terrace, attempting to breathe through the tension, when a quiet voice spoke behind her. You're handling yourself admirably. Isolde turned to see Celine standing there, holding a champagne flute with the kind of effortless grace that only came with decades of social warfare. Why, thank you, Isolde said, tone light. Celine smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Oh, don't misunderstand. It wasn't a compliment. More of an observation. Isolde exhaled, slow and measured. I'd expect nothing less. Celine took a sip of her drink, gaze sweeping over the crowd. You must understand how unusual this is. A woman like you, someone from such a humble background, suddenly stepping into a world like this. It's the sort of thing people talk about for years. A polite chuckle came from somewhere nearby. Isolde clenched her jaw, keeping her smile pleasantly neutral. And yet, here I am. Celine's expression didn't shift. Yes. Here you are. The conversation ended there, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew sharper, a low hum beneath the noise of clinking glasses and elegant laughter. Then someone tapped a spoon against their glass. The chatter in the room dipped, voices lowering as heads turned toward the front of the space. A waiter stepped forward, placing a microphone in Celine's hand. Ladies and gentlemen, she said smoothly, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Evander and his surprising engagement. There were a few quiet murmurs at that, followed by the gentle clinking of glasses. Isolde felt the beginnings of something cold settle in her stomach. Celine continued, voice effortlessly warm. As his mother, I must admit, this is not the match I ever imagined for him. I always thought he would choose someone who, she paused, as if carefully selecting her words. Someone more familiar with our world. Someone near the front stifled a laugh. But Evander has always been unconventional, Celine went on, eyes flicking toward her son. And I suppose that is why we all love him. He has chosen a woman who, against all odds, has found her way into this room. Isolde's fingers curled around the stem of her glass. Celine's gaze swept across the room, as if inviting the guests to drink in the spectacle of it all. A woman who has led such a unique life. A single mother, building her small business with such determination. It is quite the inspiring story. A few people nodded politely. Others simply watched, waiting. Celine smiled. It just goes to show that sometimes, the most unexpected people can find themselves in the most unlikely places. The applause that followed was light, almost hesitant. Isolde sat very still, heat creeping up her neck. Celine turned back toward her, expression carefully composed. And so, as a gesture of my support for this engagement, I'd like to offer Isolde a gift. A waiter stepped forward, placing an envelope in Celine's hand. A quiet hush fell over the crowd. Celine extended the envelope toward her, voice soft, almost sympathetic. A little something to help make the transition easier. After all, this life isn't for everyone. Someone gasped. The noise in the room dropped into silence. Every pair of eyes turned to Isolde. Waiting. Watching. She could feel Evander now, moving through the crowd, could sense the tension in him before he even reached her side. But she didn't look at him. She didn't look at anyone. She just stared at the envelope, at the implication of it, at what Celine was saying without saying it at all. Leave. Take the money and walk away. Know your place. Isolde swallowed against a sharp sting in her throat, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. Celine smiled, waiting. The envelope sat between them, a small, almost insignificant thing. Just a delicate slip of paper, crisp and untouched, resting in Celine's perfectly manicured hand. But it might as well have been a loaded weapon, held out in the open for everyone to see. Isolde knew exactly what this was. It wasn't just money, it was a verdict. A declaration that she did not belong, that her presence in this room was a mistake to be corrected. It was an exit package, a neat little sum to encourage her to make the right decision and walk away before she embarrassed herself further. Across the room, Evander had stiffened, eyes sharp, fists clenched at his sides. He was already stepping forward, already pulling in a furious breath, but before he could say a word, Isolde reached out. She plucked the envelope from Celine's hand with careful precision, turning it over between her fingers, as if examining the weight of it. The entire room held its breath. Then she smiled. It wasn't forced. It wasn't tight with barely concealed rage. It was effortless, warm, so completely at odds with the moment that she saw it happen, the briefest flicker of confusion in Celine's eyes, the way a few guests glanced at one another, thrown off balance. "Well, this is incredibly generous of you," Isolde said, tilting her head slightly, as if she were genuinely touched. Celine's lips parted, as if uncertain whether to accept the compliment or brace for the impact. Isolde took her time, letting the silence stretch before she turned to face the rest of the crowd. "Everyone, I think we should take a moment to appreciate Celine's extraordinary generosity." Murmurs stirred. Someone laughed under their breath. Isolde held up the envelope, letting it catch the light. "You see, I was just discussing with Evander how I wanted to start a single mother support program through the Dane Foundation." She turned back to Celine, all pleasant sincerity. "And this will be the perfect donation to get it started." A ripple of surprise passed through the room, a subtle but undeniable shift in energy. Isolde could feel the reactions happening in real time, the way some guests perked up with interest, how others exchanged delighted glances, the quiet, muffled chuckles from those who had clearly expected a much different outcome. For the first time all evening, Celine's expression wavered. It was slight, a flicker, a moment of something cold and unreadable passing behind her eyes before she recovered, lips curving into a strained imitation of amusement. "Well," she said smoothly, "I can't think of a more worthy cause." A few guests clapped. Someone whispered something that made their companion choke back laughter. Evander, who had been tense with fury only moments ago, now looked at Isolde with something bordering on awe. He stepped forward and took her hand, solid and sure, his voice carrying across the room with quiet conviction. "That's why I love her," he said simply. The applause grew louder. Celine, trapped, forced her most gracious smile, but Isolde could feel the anger coiling beneath the surface, the calculations already beginning behind those sharp eyes. This had not been her intended outcome. But in front of all these people, she had no choice but to nod along, to pretend this had been her plan all along, to wear the mask of approval even as the moment slipped completely out of her control. Isolde didn't let go of Evander's hand. She just smiled at his mother and held her ground. The house had emptied out, but the tension remained. The grand ballroom, once filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and the low hum of conversation, was now quiet, save for the distant sound of staff cleaning up the remnants of the evening. Isolde had retreated to the terrace for some air, the cool night breeze a relief against the heat still clinging to her skin. She had made it through the night. More than that, she had won. She heard Celine's measured footsteps before she saw her. "You handled yourself well this evening," Celine said, stepping onto the terrace, voice light, almost amused. Isolde turned, finding her future mother-in-law standing in the doorway, framed by the glow of the chandelier inside. She looked untouched by the evening's events, every strand of her hair in place, her expression composed, unreadable. But Isolde had seen the moment Celine lost control. She had felt it shift in the air when the check was returned, repurposed, weaponized. She had watched the older woman mask her reaction, forced to accept a public defeat. Celine walked forward, her heels clicking against the stone, and Isolde didn't move. "I imagine you're quite pleased with yourself," Celine said, tilting her head just slightly. "You turned a delicate moment into a spectacle. Quite the performance." Isolde smiled, polite. "I prefer to think of it as creative problem-solving." Celine's expression didn't waver. "Ah, yes. You do have quite the talent for adapting, don't you?" There it was again. That carefully concealed bite, the subtle suggestion that Isolde was merely playing a role in a world she didn't belong to. Isolde folded her arms. "If you're waiting for me to gloat, you'll be disappointed." Celine let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was low, calculated, something that belonged to a woman who had spent years dismantling people with a glance. "I have built this family's name," Celine said, her voice smooth as glass. Every connection, every alliance, every decision has been made with purpose. And you, she exhaled, shaking her head just slightly, as if mildly inconvenienced. You are a disruption. A woman with no pedigree, no history, no understanding of what this world requires. Isolde felt the weight of those words settle between them. A different woman, a younger version of herself, perhaps, might have let them land. Might have folded under the pressure of them. But Isolde had spent years learning to stand on her own, to build something from nothing, to carve out a life where there had once been only survival. She stepped closer, her voice steady. Then I'll redefine what belonging means. Celine's lips parted, just slightly. Isolde held her gaze, unflinching. I don't want a war, Celine. I never did. But if you think I'm going to be another one of your carefully arranged pieces, moved in and out of place at your discretion, you're mistaken. A beat of silence stretched between them. Then Celine smiled. Not in approval, but in understanding. It was the smile of a woman who had finally recognized an opponent worth considering. The headlines the next morning were brutal. From florist to future Dane, how Isolde stole the night. A socialite's downfall? Celine Dane outmaneuvered by her future daughter-in-law. Evander Dane's fiancée holds her own, and the room takes notice. Every article highlighted Isolde's composure, her poise, the way she had turned an attempted humiliation into something powerful. The press, always eager for a shift in dynamics, ate up the underdog narrative, painting Isolde as clever, bold, refreshingly unshaken. And perhaps the worst part, for Celine, at least, was that women from her own circles were beginning to take interest. Isolde found herself fielding unexpected invitations, coffees, luncheons, quiet requests to meet sometime, from women who had spent years maneuvering within this world. Some were curious, others impressed, but one thing was certain. Isolde was no longer just Evander's fiancée. She was someone to watch. Celine Dane had spent years mastering the art of control. And now, she was losing it. The headlines had been relentless. The business world, which had once revered Celine Dane as an unshakable force, was now watching her with scrutiny. Investors whispered. Board members speculated. Isolde Laurent won society over, but what about Celine Dane? Dane matriarch stumbles as future daughter-in-law gains influence. Isolde's strength turns heads. Is it time for Celine to step aside? It was absurd. Decades of power, of control, of shaping narratives, all of it suddenly fragile in the face of a single woman who refused to yield. Celine had built an empire on perception. She had been calculated, strategic, ruthless when necessary. But this battle was not private, it had unfolded in front of peers, competitors, the press. And in every version of the story, Isolde was the one who had won. At first, Celine had dismissed it as temporary noise, something that would fade with time. But the murmurs didn't stop. They only grew louder. She found herself in a rare position, a woman who had spent years ensuring her relevance, now facing an uncomfortable reality. She was on the wrong side of the story. And that was bad for business. The wedding arrived with the kind of spectacle expected of the Dane name. The venue was breathtaking, a setting so perfect it might as well have been designed for a magazine spread. The guests were powerful, the atmosphere elegant, the air humming with anticipation. Celine stood near the front, her face a practiced mask, her posture impeccable. She watched as heads turned toward the aisle, as whispers softened, as the music swelled. And then, there she was. Isolde walked forward, not alone, not fragile, but with a 6-year-old boy at her side, his small hand gripping hers with unwavering confidence. Calix, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his expression serious, determined, walked his mother down the aisle with a kind of self-possessed certainty that was impossible to ignore. Celine hadn't expected that. She had expected tradition, a father, an uncle, some distant relative stepping in to take the place of the role left empty in Isolde's past. But Isolde had chosen this. A boy leading his mother toward a future that was entirely her own making. And somehow, that made it impossible to look away. The ceremony was beautiful, effortless. There was laughter, quiet smiles exchanged between Evander and Isolde, a kind of unshakable ease in the way they looked at each other. Celine had been to hundreds of weddings. Ones where the air was thick with obligation, where the bride and groom performed the necessary traditions with the weight of expectations pressing down on them. But this wasn't duty. This was choice. By the time Evander and Isolde exchanged vows, Celine knew. She had already lost. Not in the way she had feared, not in the way that threatened the Dane name, not in a way that would crumble the empire she built. She had lost something else. Her son. Not his love, not his loyalty, but the hold she once had on him. And yet, as guests approached her during the reception, offering quiet compliments, "It's good to see you accepting this, Celine. She's stronger than I expected." A different kind of Dane, but impressive nonetheless. She understood something she had never considered before. She could continue fighting. Or she could choose something else. Later, when the guests were settled, the music soft, and the evening winding down, she found Isolde standing by the terrace, looking out at the gardens below. She approached without pretense, without performance. Isolde turned, her expression unreadable. Celine exhaled. "I will never fully approve of you," she said. "But I see now that you won't break." Isolde didn't flinch, didn't look away. She simply nodded once, something like understanding settling between them. Celine had spent her life shaping the Dane legacy, ensuring that no one could challenge her authority. But now, she was standing across from someone who had never needed her approval in the first place. She may not love Isolde. But she knew, without a doubt, that she had met her match.